Welcome to Rocking Our Priors. I'm your host, Dr. Alice Evans, and with me today is the brilliant economic historian, Professor Jared Rubin, author of two cracking books, Ruler, Religion and Riches, and How the World Became Rich. And I thoroughly recommend them both. Now, in today's podcast, we're going to discuss why the Middle East fell behind, the drivers of the Islamic Revival, the Meiji Restoration in Japan, and the Protestant Reformation. And then applying all those ideas on technology and contemporary backlash to contemporary politics. Jared, welcome.
Thank you. Very, very much pleasure to be here.
Okay, let's go back to your brilliant book of 2017. Why did the Middle East fall behind? Can you give those who have not dabbled in Rubinese, can you give them a quick update?
Sure. To be clear, the book gets at one reason. There's several competing, but I think more than likely complementary reasons why it's the case. The explanation that I focus on is mainly political economy and the role that religion plays in political economy. To be clear up front, one thing that came through when doing this went back to my dissertation research when reading through, I was open to any possible explanation that I wanted to get at the big question. When the book compares Western Europe, Christianized Western Europe, and the Islamic Middle East, mainly kind of the broader what became the Ottoman world. And one thing that became clear is that some religious dictates might have mattered, but in the big picture mattered less than the role that religion plays in political economy. I'd look, for instance, at taking interest on loans as something as something that when I first started looking at it might have played a role in the relative economic stagnation of the Middle East. We know that, for instance, banking was way delayed in the Middle East relative to the West, even though the Middle East was far ahead of Western Europe for centuries after the spread of Islam. But even then, that seemed to be more of a symptom, than a fundamental cause. And the fundamental cause that I ended up focusing on was to not completely dismiss any type of role of religion, but really the way that religion legitimates political rule. In both Western Christianity and medieval to early modern Islam, religion played a very, very important role in legitimating rule. A medieval Christian king was unlikely to last very long if they did not have the support of the papacy. Whereas, much like the local powerful ulema would have been a major source of legitimacy for a medieval Muslim ruler. And what ended up happening, and I think that this is something that also really shows the benefits of a comparative approach. In late medieval Christianity, the church became less of a source of legitimacy. This was in part due to the revival of commerce, which increased the power of city-states as well as what we might call commercial actors, whether they be merchants or those that were engaged in production and like guild members, things like that. And eventually, even prior to the Reformation, some Christian rulers started, bringing in these groups of people, including churchmen. I mean, the church still remained an important source of legitimacy, but also great lords, as well as urban dwellers into parliaments. And what this did is it gave a forum for a wide array of interests to negotiate with rulers. Whereas in the Middle East, this never really happened. The rulers were more powerful for several reasons. Some of which the literature gives. There's a large literature on this, namely, access to coercive power. But also one thing that stuck for a very long time was the role that religious legitimacy played in upholding Islamic power or Muslim rule power. And what I tried to do was try to understand why the difference, like why did Christian power, or the power of Christianity to legitimate rule, decline again, even prior to the Reformation. With the Reformation, in those places that reformed, the not just the Catholic Church obviously became powerless, but even the Protestant churches that supplanted it were relatively weaker sources of legitimacy. Most were under the thumb of the rulers. Why were there differences in this? And part of this does have to do with some tenets of the religions themselves. So if there's going to be any aspect of religious doctrine that might have mattered, it's more so this than, say, views on taking interest on loans or just about any other aspect of religious doctrine, which for a very long time, in the early 20th century, Islam was just viewed as conservative, or there's something about Islam that was antithetical to commercial enterprise, which doesn't really seem to accord with the historical record. As I said, the Islamic world was way ahead of Western Europe for centuries after the spread of Islam, and was very much a commercial religion. Muhammad himself was engaged in commerce. But there is, and I think it's due to the natures in which the religions were formed. There is doctrine in Christianity. So, Christianity, of course, formed in the Roman Empire as a minority religion, and just for survival purposes, there was a distinct notion of separate realms of church and state. For the first 3 centuries, Christians had no possibility of legitimating the Roman Empire. There just weren't enough of them. There were a vast minority, whereas Islam formed at the same time as empire, and the Islamic Empire spread rather rapidly. This was as the corpus of Islamic law was just beginning to formed over the first few centuries of Islam. And as this was forming, it was very useful to have an ideology that gave rulers power by acting in accordance with the doctrine of Islam.
Okay, I understand. Yeah. Okay, so let me crudely summarize, and then I want to ask 2 little questions.
Sure.
So, as I understand it, you're basically saying that in the Middle East and North Africa, rulers relied heavily on religious authorities for legitimacy, and that prevented them from introducing reforms which would have promoted economic development.
Yep.
So one question I have, since 2017, have you revised any of your priors? Like, for example, there is that one juicy little debate on the printing press. Whether or not it was really bad. And I wonder how you might have, responded to any discussions and debates on that literature.
Well, okay, there's several questions there. Maybe I'll start with the printing press one. So part of what I put forth with the printing press was, so we know that the first printing press in the Arabic script in the Ottoman Empire was in 1727. We know that there was a formal decree by the Sultan that permitted printing and made it clear that this was an art form that had not been a part of the Ottoman world. We do know that there were minority presses in the Ottoman Empire that had been permitted, at least by minority, I mean here scripts like Hebrew or Greek that were not in the Arabic script. And actually, with a few other researchers, Metin Joskel at University of Connecticut and Thomas Sully, also at Connecticut, we had a paper that suggested that this was part of a political economy equilibrium, in which rulers received religious legitimacy, and the more that religious legitimacy mattered, the more that, as you just summarized, you're going to the religious authorities are going to be part of the ruling coalition. They'll be part of political bargaining, and the last thing you want to do is undermine them. And the printing press had the capacity to undermine religious authority. Clearly, did so in the case of Europe with the helping spur on the Reformation. So there's a large literature that suggests that there was an actually formal ban put forth in 1485. So you're
still going with that? You're still going with the idea that
I'm just summarizing the literature.
Oh, right. So I apologize.
So there's a large literature that we built on that says there was a formal ban in 1485, reaffirmed in the 1510s, that banned printing, and that's largely been the consensus until pretty recently. Some historians have questioned whether that ban actually existed. My take on it is that in some senses, it didn't matter whether it was formally banned or not. It was very clear that there were consequences to anyone who, or maybe it's not very clear. I think there would actually be some that would disagree with this, but it was clear that actually, given the tone of the 1727 decree, that this was something that was not openly permitted prior to prior to 1727, and it would have been very risky for somebody to take this on prior to 1727. So whether it was formally banned or not, when we think about what the broader equilibrium, how we think about the actions of potential printers, how the sultans and the ulema would have, the religious scholars would have reacted. In a sense, this is all part of an equilibrium. So to give you to give your listeners rather a sense of what this means, is sometimes in this kind of economic concept of equilibrium, there's actions that aren't taken, but those actions that aren't taken are an important part of the way that they're an important part of the outcome that we're interested in. The problem for the historian or the economic historian is when we think in these terms of actions that aren't taken, is it's hard to find evidence, because it's much easier to find evidence, of course, of actions that are taken. So this is where modeling and thinking about what are the incentives of various players helps us think through. So yeah, in my mind, I've seen some, I think it's fairly somewhat convincing evidence, at least, that the ban might not have been as formally construed as the older historians that we relied on would have you believe, because there is no actual physical document that shows that reveals this 14.
I'm going to push back in two ways.
Yeah.
So even if it's true that the Sultan had an incentive to create that climate of repression, were these early states totalitarian and repressive in that way? I mean, looking at the evidence, say, from Michael Cook and other environmental historians, I want to raise two concerns. One is that we see across the Ottoman Empire and many Islamic states is there was a vast religious syncretism. So there's Sufism, there are traditional rituals, there's all kind of blending and diversity. And to me, that heterodoxy existing even in, right in the heart of the Ottoman Empire tells us that these authorities weren't that strong. So even where there were bans on apostasy, even when there's all kinds of persecution, a lot of people did their own thing in quite, unorthodox, syncretic ways. And that makes me wonder whether these states were so totalitarian that they could stamp out their authority in either secular or religious ways. And another concern I wanted to raise with you is maybe to push back about this emphasis on institutions and to think more about geography. So I was reading environmental historians like Sam White and J.R. McNeil, and they highlight that 90% of the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia is largely unsuitable for agriculture. What's also distinctive about the region is that, unlike South Asia, unlike China, there is this vast intersecting patchwork of agricultural land and also pastoral land. So that means that these peasants and farmers are living in close proximity. So you always had those nomadic pastoralists on your border, ready to do the Ibn Khaldun, raiding and pillaging. And so for that reason, states would have been constantly on their guard. And that's why, Fez in many parts of the Middle East or North Africa, that you have these walled cities, walling you from the barbarians who are, and that would have also, without those vast agrarian plains, that would have made it harder for states to accumulate tax. That could have inhibited commerce because it's so hard to develop revenues. So you have these walled cities, you have these scattered populations across oases and riverine settlements, and those constant nomadic incursions could have been a real battery on state finances. So, there are all kinds of, there's the Seleucid rebellion in the Ottoman Empire. And so for those sorts of reasons, I'm thinking, combining that with the religious syncretism as well, I'm thinking, well, there's a lot of heterodox religious practices. There's a lot of nomadic incursions. Were these states really that strong? And were institutions the primary barrier? Could another possible explanation for the Middle East and North Africa falling behind was that really it's difficult to develop a thriving economy when you've got all these little nomadic incursions, etc., and you don't have vast agrarian plains that they had in the Pearl River Delta or in North India or stuff like that. So I wonder if geography is another explanation.
So I think there's related answers to all these issues. The first one is I 100% agree with you that, and I think most that study this would agree, that the state/fiscal capacity of the Ottoman Empire was very low. It didn't, especially in the provinces, it didn't have a ton of capacity to enact law and order. I mean, it decentralized everything in order to do this, mainly via military elites that received rewards
Yeah,
for
they're tax
military
farming,
service.
right?
Yeah, tax farming, but it's more than just tax farming. Oh boy.
Listeners, Jared Rubin will return with us in 1 minute. I'll do my jazz hands.
We can't access you? Hoping I'm here.
Abracadabra.
Can you hear me?
Jared, I can hear you, but you've turned into a green screen, and I hope it's not permanent.
I hope not either.
Are we back in business?
Record. This is weird.
It's no problem. So in many ways, we're just reliving the Ottoman Empire, where weak technology is constraining the imperial reach, right?
I have a thing saying device struggling to record.
I see.
Let's see.
Let me bring you back into business. Now I'm alone and Jared is gone. Jared, come back to me. Hold on 1 minute, gang. I'm confident he will return. Listeners, I apologize for this. Jared is in California. They should be up to date and tech savvy. Britain is ahead. Let's see if he's emailed me. I do apologize, dear listener. We will resume service momentarily. Well, at least if the podcast ends there, at least it sounds like Jared just ends by agreeing with me, right? Even if that's all there is to it. You just have Jared agreeing with me. That's how I like to end all conversations. Okay. Let's find out what's going on. He's disappeared. No email from him. I don't think there's any point. I'll just stay cool. Says Jared's device is not accessible. Hmm. Jared, are you returning? Jared, I see your name written, but no visual or audio. Since your devices are not accessible. Jared, if you can hear me, don't worry about all this, because in the editing I can just cut out this section. Mm. Mm. Jared? No, I can't hear you at all. Your sound says... I can hear you very faintly. Yeah, very, very faintly. I don't know where you're hiding. You're hiding somewhere. Ah, you're even... Where are you hiding? You've disappeared. Gang, in what appears to be a global first for Rocking Our Priors, the guest has disappeared midway. Right, ready? You're back. Yeah, but you're so faint. What happened? Okay, why is it so faint? Is it possible to use... Because you're so faint. I am bellowing in comparison. I'm like the Saudi Arabia Wahhabi backed by oil-rich petro-dollars. You are like Sufism. No one is going to hear you now. Okay. Take your time, no rush. Gang, I'm just doing a podcast with the great economic historian Jared Rubin. We were in deep discussion, and I was sharing it. Gang, I'm just doing a podcast with the great... No, wait. Gang, I'm just doing a podcast with the fantastic economic historian, Professor Jared Rubin, and I was asking him a particularly dicey question, and then what happened is his internet cut out, or so he said. But he's now back, and the episode is live streaming live on YouTube. So you can listen there via my channel, or you can tune into our podcast, Rocking Our Prize, when it's out. Okay, Jared is back, and we're going to duel. I'm promoting us on YouTube. Ready? So faint. I can't hear you. Like a faint murmur. Yeah, I'm just doing a podcast with a fantastic... You were perfect before. Is it possible to use the old microphone? Because if you speak and then you see the little sidebar, you should see that it barely moves up with the green when you speak. Do you see that? Say something, you'll see that it doesn't go very far up. Yeah, so you're like 2 bars. Don't worry, take your time. Now I've totally lost you.
All right. There we
Oh
go.
my goodness, you're back in business.
All
Wow.
right. I think it just required a reset. All right. Let's hope that's all this
Okay.
is.
Okay, fantastic. So you were just saying Alice Evans is right in all things.
I
We can
was. That's
start from there.
exactly what I was saying. Should
Okay,
we?
please proceed. Please proceed.
All right.
Just those
So
exact words. If you do those exact words, it'll sound better.
the a seamless transition. No, so I certainly agree with you that, and I think most that study this period would, that the Ottoman state had very weak fiscal and state capacity. It was a state that, if there was stuff going on in the provinces that the Sultan in Istanbul didn't like, it would have been very hard for the Sultan to do anything about it unless the decentralized tax farmer slash purveyor of law and order also wanted that done. If they didn't, there would have been very little that could have been done. So, as you say, there was a lot of syncretism. There was a lot of things that the religious establishment, to the extent that there was one, and there was one in the Ottoman Empire, would not have liked, but there was little capacity to do anything about. That said, within the capital itself, there was much more capacity to prevent things from that was yeah that would have threatened the Sultan's power. That's really what matters here. It's the Sultan's playing a game, not caring so much about religious authority for religious authority's sake, but what it can offer the Sultan. And to the extent that a press would have emerged in the Ottoman Empire, given literacy rates being rather low, it is rather hard to imagine one emerging anywhere but in the environs of Istanbul, or possibly one of the other major cities in the empire, with which there was more capacity for the state to intervene. So, is it a totalitarian state? No, it didn't have the capacity to be so. Was it even totalitarian within the capital itself? Not really. This is also, it's not just religious syncretism, but this is also an empire that ruled over a lot of Christians and Jews, and this was not this was by no means an empire that wanted any type of religious orthodoxy or anything. What it did want, though, was the support of the religious establishment. And I think that's almost uncontroversial. The question that is more controversial, though, is what this meant for political and economic outcomes.
Sure, but even if I want the support of the religious authorities, that doesn't necessarily mean that, but for that was the reason that they fell behind. So I'm saying, there could have been these other geographical constraints, even if they wanted extra legitimacy from religious authorities.
So I think that these are related. So my take on one, at least an important reason why religion mattered, and the declining importance of religion in politics mattered for Europe, was who replaced the religious authorities were parliaments in Europe. Rather, so as sources of legitimacy, and that means that different interests came to the political bargaining table. You get more interests that have commercial, trade ideas in mind, and you do start to see more laws and policies that favor this. And also, to be clear, I mean, I don't think that this. I also don't think that this is the only difference between the two, or the only salient difference. When it comes to geography, I think it's certainly true that it would be hard to imagine something like a takeoff happening in certain parts of the broader Islamic world. I mean, I can't imagine it happening in the Arabian Peninsula, for instance, for reasons that you noted. As you noted, also proximity to the steppe and kind of nomadic incursions, which plagued China, it plagued Eastern Europe, it certainly plagued parts of the Middle East. Of course, Baghdad was completely sacked under the Abbasid Empire. All of these certainly played a role in how the history played out. What I would push back a little bit on, though, is that there was a thriving intellectual, academic, scientific culture that emerged over centuries in the Middle East, regardless. yes, geography kind of changes over time a little bit, and its reaction to, both through climate as well as how it interacts with the society's institutions does change, but it's relatively, it changes relatively less, of course, than its institutions and culture. What I
Well,
would,
Michael Cook's
yeah,
point on that, Michael Cook's point, and I see
yeah,
Michael Cook is my personal deity. Michael Cook says that, he says 2 points. Is first of all, some of the intellectual thriving environment that was just due to patronage from rulers, so could come apart
yeah,
slightly from the
yeah,
underlying economic conditions. On top of that, Iraq's agriculture declined so precipitously that
yeah.
could feed into a broader decline. So I think, agriculture could matter to some extent there.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, and I think that it's hard to imagine Europe taking off as it did without having major advances in agriculture that uh, freed up large parts of the population to engage in industrial pursuits. Um, yeah, so I think in terms of geography / climate, I think would be another. I think that explanations relying on climate, and this kind of more so pushes towards my other book that you mentioned at the beginning, How the World Became Rich. In that book, we take on 5 different sets of explanations. Geographic ones are one of them, and say any one of these types of explanations doesn't explain everything. Where the action is at the interaction of them.
Right.
And I think for the Middle East, this clearly is, the way that institutions emerged certainly is a reflection of its geographic endowments and how those were changing over time due to climate change, but also not just climate change, but due to, we might think of it as the world becoming more connected. That changes the impact that geography has. I would agree in to some degree that, though certainly not fully, that the intellectual climate of the Middle East in the, say 400 or 500 years after the spread of Islam was due to just a patronage. I think that clearly patronage was a part of it, but I think there was a culture that emerged as part of that as well that cannot be overlooked. There was no similar culture of learning except in very small pockets of Western Europe in this period. Yet there was a culture that emerged later with, whether it be the Renaissance, eventually the Enlightenment. These things, I think, these cultural attributes mattered. Of course, they were also reflective of the institutional and geographical features. So I don't have any problem with geography playing some role in this story. In fact, I definitely think it did. And that's kind of, so the Mark and my book is precisely, makes these points that this is how we should be thinking about the bigger picture. And so one reason we wrote that book is in part to kind of counteract not just the way that I wrote my book, but the way we all write our books. We all want to push forth a theory, and in doing so, if you try to take account of every other theory out there and think about how yours interacts with it, I mean, you'll be 500 pages in before you even get to what your theory is, not even then. So what we wanted to do was say, look, there's reason why when writing a kind of these big picture books, authors really try to focus in on one aspect. And there's a lot of value in doing that because it helps highlight, in the case of, in my book, for instance, the importance of religion and political economy. What, again, I put part of the first chapter of that book tries to think about how my theory relates to other theories. But of course, it's not spending a ton of time on this because it's my theory. I have to push forth, what the theory is. So what I would say to that is, I agree that the way we think about the long run divergence, whether it be East versus West, Western Europe versus Middle East. I mean, these are all questions that, there's no one answer for sure. In fact, I think there's very different answers for East Asia versus Western Europe as there is Western Europe versus the Middle East. But do I think institutions, and especially religious institutions and political institutions, played a role in this case? I have not changed my mind on that. In that, I still think that they played a fairly significant role in the divergence between the two worlds.
Great. I want to ask you a follow-up question because you were talking about that culture in the maybe first 500 years of Islam. And so your first book argues that Islam served to legitimize rulers, creating these institutional path dependencies. And I totally buy, or let's grant no, I do buy that may have strengthened religious authorities. But I think there's another very important cultural shift in Islam, that is the current onus on scriptural literacism. Let's understand exactly what the Quran says and let's apply exactly what the Quran says. Now, in Timur Kuran's book, I think came out last year, Freedom's Delayed, he argues that Islamic literalism resulted from specific theological shifts. So he talks about scholars with like Shafi'i and Ibn Habbal in the 9th century who prioritized scripture over reason, and then hardening under Ghazali and Taymiyyah, and they expanded the concept of blasphemy and heresy to enforce orthodoxy. And then he also talks about Ottoman rulers using state-sanctioned religious oppression. So I think there are two important points. So one is that you said, under the founding of, under the spread, the conquest of the Arab Islamic conquest, institutionalized, baked in the importance of getting religious authority from legitimacy from religious authorities. Then I think there's a separate question, is that why did Islam develop in such a way that there's this very strong onus on what scripture says, rather than using it, the closing of the gates of jihad from, say, the 12th century, for example. Why do you think that came about? Was it inevitable, or was it contingent? Was there a specific theological reason? Was there a intellectual reason? Or was it more about political economy, that we had this emergence of the Quran says this and we must apply that very literally? Because I think that's a very pertinent point to contemporary Islam across the Islamic world. It's very, very pertinent. And I want to understand, why is it? So was it inevitable, baked in from the founding? Is it something more about the 9th century? Is it more about Wahhabism and the Wahhabi-Saud alliance, from the early 1800s, and then baked in and then propagated through the Saudi Petro-dollars? Why do we have this current onus on what scripture says?
Wow. So there's a lot going on there. The this quote unquote closing of the gate of Ishtad happened, 11th, 12th-ish century. Obviously, it's not an actual formal event, but it's something where looking backwards essentially becomes the way of thinking about things. New interpretations are not supposed to emerge. And I think if I understand your question, which is a very good one, is it whether this was something that was inevitable? Why did it happen? I certainly do not think it was inevitable. I think it was an outcome, and not surprisingly, given what we just talked about, I do think it was a political economy outcome. And let's put aside Wahhabism for a second, because this obviously happens much later, and I think that they were building a lot off of certain traditions that could be employed by an enterprising group of wannabe rulers. So what happened in this period was, as Quran also describes, this was beginning in about the 9th, but particularly the 10th century under the Abbasid Empire. This is when the religious establishment really began to be consolidated. When we talk about the religious establishment, this was, for the first several centuries of Islam, there was no such thing. This was something where there was not even by any means an agreed upon Islamic doctrine. It was very different depending on where you were. It was very responsive to local needs. And in fact, for the first century or two of Islam, most of the qadis, the Islamic jurists, were sent out. There wasn't even necessarily a requirement to be steeped in doctrinal thought. It was because there was no universal doctrinal thought. There was, of course, the Quran and some hadith. So hadith are kind of the sayings of the Prophet as given by his companions, but none of these even were universally recognized. So there was a process that did take several centuries. And again, this is why. So even in Sunni Islam, there's 4 major schools of Sunni Islam, and this is legal schools. In the 10th century, there were way more than 4. There were schools that, of course, they all have similarities. They're not kind of overtly antithetical to anything in the Quran, but there are differences in what they permit. There's different, especially in things like family law and in commercial law. And again, yeah, this is really a function of, or it's really an outcome of local needs and the types of cases that were brought. And what this meant is that, again, for the first few centuries, there were no real kind of political economy pushback from religious authorities. It was relatively straightforward for an Abbasid sultan, or before then Umayyad sultan, or in Spain, to have local religious authorities largely support their actions, cloak it in some type of legal justification, whether it be of course consistent with Islam, but what does that mean in this period, is actually, I think, not completely clear. In the course of about the 9th, 10th century, though, what begins happening is there starts to become a consolidation within the Abbasid Empire of the religious elites, and with this becomes a consolidation of certain branches, at least, of religious thought. And the way that I think about it, at least, is that the consolidation helps lead to an outcome whereby now the clerics, because they are more centralized, even though, to be clear, they're not. Your listeners should not be drawing comparisons to like the Catholic Church or anything here. There's nothing like an actual hierarchy or an actual centralization, but it does become but interpretations become more streamlined, in the sense of you're sending somebody out to maybe a province somewhere, some Abbasid province. They're going to have more of an idea of what quote unquote Islamic law is at the time. This means that those that are the best is maybe the wrong, the chief is the chief religious authorities, those with the most prestige, the most power, now have significantly more bargaining power vis-a-vis the state. And when this happens, there's now an incentive for all of the parties to not allow too much reinterpretation, new interpretations of laws. I hate doing this, but I should be clear. This concept of the closing of the gate of ijtihad has been kind of dismantled by subsequent scholars. It's certainly true that reinterpretation slowed down after about the 11th, call it 12th century, in terms of new laws, new Islamic laws coming about, but it never fully stopped. There are examples for much later of reinterpretations happening, but I do think it's broad, but it gets at kind of a stylized fact that Islam became more backwards looking in this period. And my take is that this certainly required a cultural and philosophical shift, but this cultural and philosophical shift went hand in hand with the political economy changes that emerged from having a more powerful religious establishment.
Right. So as the religious authorities become more powerful, and as say, I mean, what do you buy of sort of Ahmet Kuru's idea that you have to be a pupil of Ghazali to gain status, and it's the patronage of Ghazali which motivates everyone to sing from the same hymn sheet? And then, Ghazali's critics, what's the quote that you cannot find even, damn it, I'm trying to think of the name of the dissident, but you cannot find the dissident's book in the library or something like that, because everyone has to follow Ghazali, for example.
I think, so that would apply in certain parts of the Islamic world, not in parts in others. But there's somebody else for whom that became that became the source of authority. The sources of authority became very narrowed in the 11th and 12th centuries, to the point where over the span of less than a century, we more or less get 4 consolidated schools. They're largely geographically separate. They formed, as I've been noting here, in different contexts. So there are some surface level differences between these schools. But that's right. It's depending on which school we're talking about. Following those people was the source of authority. And
right. I have 2 more questions. I have 2 more questions to nuance this again. And I think another important distinguishing feature of contemporary Islam is that people look to the respected authorities, the best people, the people who were taught at IUM, the people that trained at the Islamic University of Medina, or people who were trained at Al-Azhar. For example, here in Britain, we have the Islam channel, which is broadcast to a majority of Muslims. And on that channel, if you watch Islam Q&A, which I do, obviously, all the scholars will be trained at Al-Azhar. And, Al-Azhar is so highly esteemed across the Islamic world. For fun, I did Google Trends looking at which country is like searching for Al-Azhar scholars. Like in Indonesia, it's super, super high, like really strong reverence for the Al-Azhar. People who go back
That's
to,
interesting.
And there's so many, I can share this really nice book by Beno from this on like IUM and Al-Azhar. People who go to Al-Azhar and IUM, then go back to Kano, for example, in northern Nigeria, or go back to Malaysia. They're the people who are super respected because they have the proper knowledge. It's only those authorities who are capable of tafsir, for example. Us mere mortals, we cannot, so even though the gates of jihad are still open to some extent, like let me give an example and I'll stop. For example, something that came up in the early 20th century is photography allowed, right? So in the Quran, it very clearly says that image making is not allowed, and anyone who has images in their homes, they're going to hell. But then people reinterpreted this, that maybe photography is okay. And lots of Muslims today, they may still have photos on their phone. Now, I personally think that seems in contradiction to the Quran, because the Quran is very clear that you shouldn't have any images in your house. And if your phone is in your house, then you shouldn't have any photos on your phone. But people interpret it, right? So that's modern interpretation. But still, they when they want to find out these answers, they go on Islam Q&A online and they say, is it permissible for me to take photos? Is photography permitted? It's not sola scriptura, the Protestant idea of the individual interpreting the Bible for himself. It's very much looking to the best people at IUM and Al-Azhar. And that's another argument, aspect that I'm interested in. Why is there this focus on the respected authorities rather than the sola scriptura idea?
Oh, this is something that goes back to among the earliest days of Islam. The way that religious authorities gained authority was, so for centuries, over many different dynasties, it doesn't really matter what what period you're talking about, as long as it's after the spread of Islam, really, and up through relatively recently. In historical terms, you would gain, if you wanted to be an authoritative religious authority, it was about going from place to place, learning from these people, oftentimes reciting long passages, getting the approval of other people that were respected. That's how you became respected yourself, and then it becomes a chain of and you can actually link these chains from this person studied with this person, who studied with this person, who studied with this person, and ideally this would go all the way back to the Prophet. This is something that is very, very old in Islam, and it is interesting to me to hear that. I wouldn't have guessed this, that people in Indonesia, in particular, are so, because these are very different parts of the world we're talking about.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I can go on. In Indonesia, it was actually very interesting that, there's a nice book by Kutabi, for example, and he talks about in the in the 19th century, as transport improved, as telecommunications improved, people went to study at Al-Azhar. They came back. They founded a journal in Southeast Asia called the Call of Al-Azhar. They translated things from Al-Azhar. There was such a reverence from what they were saying in Al-Azhar. And so, for example, when Al-Azhar condemned secularizing reforms in Turkey, that was reprinted in Indonesia and Malaysia. And people were like, they've gone wrong. They requested fatwas from Al-Azhar. I think, and Bano makes this case, where are people requesting fatwas from? And here is another interesting example. When Sarkozy wanted to ban the hijab, he sought approval from Al-Azhar, knowing how highly esteemed Al-Azhar is in Western Europe. Yeah. And Al-Azhar even has translated hotlines in every language. For Western Europeans, Al-Azhar is the top clerics from Al-Azhar regularly appeared on Al Jazeera, for example. Al-Azhar is like the MIT of the Islamic world, and IUM, of course.
So I mean, this is, as I said, this is very consistent with how Islam formed over time and Islamic religious authority formed over time. It was very much, so unlike what we think of as the Catholic Church in the medieval period, there were no, in a sense, very formalized, centralized institutions. It was very decentralized. It said where the authority was, at least among the scholars, would have been well known, and the ideal would have been to study under the foremost scholars. And this meant that the best scholars would travel from place to place, whether it be Spain, Morocco, North Africa, into the Arabian Peninsula, wherever they were. This was how authority was granted. So this is the 21st century version of this with better technology.
Okay, now I want to push back because to counter my own point, historically, like before the 20th century, Sufism was very popular globally. Yep. So from northern Nigeria to Sudan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, you had the global spread of Sufi missionaries. Like Sufism was a hot thing, but it's waned over the 20th century. Why do you think that is? Why do you think we see the rise and decline? Because that isn't following the established scholars. That isn't fiqh jurisprudence. That isn't scriptural literalism. That's very much about personal engagement, community rituals. There's nothing about the text there.
Yeah, no, it's very much more of a spiritual movement that is removed. And in many ways, I mean, I think this gets back to one of your earlier questions, because this is the type of movement that a political authority with any type of state capacity would oftentimes like to squelch. I mean, there are, for instance, very similar examples of the medieval church relying on secular rulers to kind of put out what they would have viewed as heretical movements. This was the heretical movement or it's not even a movement of Islam, and especially in the medieval period, and as you mentioned, into the 19th century. Now, the degree to which the reasons for which it's declined in the late 19th and 20th centuries, I think, in many respects, is it's a fascinating question that I have thoughts on. I would say thoughts on not the type of thoughts I would be willing to publish, but thoughts on, and again, not surprisingly, given my take on this, I mean, I think there are political economy elements to this. I think part of this has to do with the world becoming more connected, and thus and states being able to have greater capacity. To be clear, this is not something that's state-driven. The decline of Sufism is not something that it's been stamped out by political authorities that viewed it as a threat. It's something that I think is much more decentralized and has become maybe just less popular. But I think it is something where, as states have, in a sense, more formalized religion, more you used it in a more formal way. I think this might get to some of the stuff we're going to talk about in a bit here. Has both, on the one hand, made the desire for more, I don't want to use the term radical because Sufism is not radical, but more non-mainstream religion. That's maybe a better term. Yeah. It's made demand for it higher on the one hand, but only among a smaller group of people. As now we have state religions that are much more mainstream in places like Pakistan, places like Bangladesh. This is going to be something where a large fraction of the population moves towards more kind of state religions in a sense, whereas we'd say Islam.
Religion. Why weren't those state religions Sufism? Okay, listen. What about
why isn't it state Sufism?
Yeah, it could have backed Sufism, right?
Well, from the political authorities' perspective, Sufism is a much worse source of legitimacy. This is about kind of getting in touch with yourself and getting in touch with the kind of more spiritual world. This is not something where you have authorities that then can use that power to legitimate the state. I think that it would be very surprising to see a state-based Sufist religion.
Okay, so you think that states might have a less incentive to back Sufism because they're not getting so much legitimacy from the masses. Okay, I want to give you 3 new hypotheses and I want you to vote on them. Okay,
All right.
so let's go for it. So one possibility is that basically, if you're a Muslim, you believe that there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is the messenger. That's the Shahada, right? So if you believe Muhammad is the messenger, then automatically the prestige is in the Quran. Right? So automatically, if you have any kind of modernization, meaning technology improvements in communications, whether that's cassettes, printing, radio, television, YouTube, Instagram, if Muhammad is the messenger, you want to study the Quran and learn what is in the text, right? So that might move you away from Sufism, which doesn't have so much theological grounding once you accept the premise of the Shahada. That's hypothesis 1, just technology and the prestige of Islam. Hypothesis 2 is that you have the Saudi Petro-dollars export shock, and they just championed this idea of Wahhabi textual literalism. And as Saudi Arabia got rich, it funded madrasas across the world. It gave money to Saudi Arabia. It welcomed labor migrants. They returned to Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sudan, championing Salafism, Wahhabism, etc. And they're sending money. So what 2 is the Saudi Arabia push for there is, only one sect will be saved. That's in the Quran itself, and that sect is the sect where there is scholarly consensus. Again, I'm quoting the Quran, and the Wahhabis are saying, this is the only game in town. You've got to be while this are against us. And then the third point is the book I shared with you recently by Zaga, where she argues that the mass schooling, that across the Middle East and North Africa, rulers identified as Muslim polities, they championed mass schooling. So anyone who goes to school is going to learn a little bit about the Quran, and ultimately they're all studying the Quran and fiqh jurisprudence. So I guess those are 3 different ideas. One is that anyone who's Muslim is going to study the Quran once you get literacy in technology and communications. 2 is that this wasn't inevitable, but this was the Wahhabi petrodollar shock. So those 2 events combined, right? The Wahhabis taking over Saudi Arabia and then Saudi Arabia getting rich. And then thirdly, people just getting educated. And it was always the educated elites who attended, even in Malaysia and in Indonesia, who were much more into, fiqh jurisprudence.
Yeah. So I strongly agree with one. I think one of them played a role, but not a huge role, and I disagree with one.
Okay.
So the one I agree with is the last one, the education. And I think that's part and parcel with how I was thinking about it as well. This education obviously doesn't come from the sky. It comes from largely the state, and as and some of this education is religious. Some of it's obviously just kind of more secular, or whatever you like to call it.
Yeah.
As exposure to both religious and secular education improves, that's typically not good for not just Sufism, but religious movements of that type across religions. And it's very clear that in the parts of the world where Sufism did have a strong hold, education has improved. It's still substandard by world standards, I think, but it's improved. It's improved considerably. So I think that in terms of of maybe one of the more proximate causes of the decline of Sufism, I think that played a big role. The one that I kind of agree with played some role is the spread of Wahhabism. I mean, I think that clearly on some margins has limited this Sufism. I think what you noted about bringing in guest workers, they return with these new ideas. That's clearly been a phenomenon that's happened, and that is going to, or did, affect other forms of Islam, Sufism being one of them. Do I think it's a dominant factor? I mean, actually, I think that reasonable people can debate this, whether your second and third hypothesis, which one's more important. My take would certainly be the third. The idea of people just being able to read the Quran for itself. I mean, this has obviously been something that could have always been the case, even though now literacy rates are much higher. The issue with that hypothesis, to me at least, is that most people, and this is true not just of Muslims, but of really any religion, really don't have the capacity to understand what is meant in whether again the Quran, the Bible, whatever. This is why we have religious authorities that people turn to. And a key source of religious authority is that they have a relative advantage in interpretation and in what is meant by these passages. So you are right that at least it makes sense intuitively that this could be the case as people become more literate in particular, that turning towards their own interpretations might mean something. But I just don't think that that's a primary source of religious change in the Islamic world in the last couple centuries. I think it's much more these other dynamics. And to be clear, the Wahhabi things is an important dynamic that does explain many aspects of Islam, both in terms of Islamic thought and the popularity of certain strands of Islamic thought vis-a-vis others, but also its role in politics in the 20th and 21st centuries.
I want to drill down on two particular bits. So which part do you think was a key causal lever, and with what effect? So I think in Saudi Arabia we see two distinct events. So one is the Wahhabi House of Saud alliance, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's possible that you have the Saudi state taking on board Wahhabism, and then just because of Saudi Arabia's status and prestige in the Islamic world, but even if they never had petro-dollars, people could still have studied at IUM because it's the Prophet's mosque, the Grand Mosque. It's got all the kudos there, right? So you want to go to MIT because it's the cool people, but the cool people are there, so you study there. So even if they didn't have much money, people were still doing, as I was saying earlier, in the early 20th century, people were going to Saudi Arabia. The Hajj has always been a religious obligation, so maybe people would have gone even if Saudi had no money, even if it was just a desert tourist spot, a desert pilgrimage spot. Maybe that Arab prestige bias would have still led to the spread of Wahhabism. So that's one hypothesis. Was it just that there happened to be this Wahhabi takeover? And they eliminated shirk and all kinds of bid'ah innovations. The second other possible causal lever is just the Wahhabi money. The Saudi money from the oil shock. They happen to sit on the energy that fueled the 20th century. Lucky them, and so all that money happened. So those are two distinct hypotheses, and then I think there are two distinct consequences. And maybe you could clarify this for me. So one is the religiosity, in that many Muslims express very high degrees of religiosity and pray, regularly, fasting for Ramadan, etc. Also, the other specific ideas are the avowal and disavowal, the Wahhabi ideas of believers and unbelievers, the idea of community policing, and the scriptural literalism. Or the push for Sharia law. In so many Muslim polities, so in Segal's book, for example, she says that 70% of Muslim polities have, religion baked into the constitution, whereas among non-Muslim polities, it's only 40%. So, we've got these different elements of religiosity. One is being very religious himself, being very pious, but also this textual literalism. So I wonder, out between those two causes and those different effects, what do you see as important and in what ways?
So the causes, I have a fairly strong opinion on this, is that it's money.
Right. Okay.
The Arabian Peninsula, the location of the House of Saud was not a prominent place, with the obvious exception of housing Mecca, Medina. This was not necessarily a prestigious state within the Islamic world. It was a place of pilgrimage. This was not necessarily the prestigious place was Istanbul. As soon as the Ottomans conquered,
Istanbul had more. I thought even the Mughals and the Ottoman sultans would give money to Mecca.
Oh, of course they would. It's still the place for It's kind of like even after the Roman Empire falls, Rome had become the house of Christianity. So Rome is a relatively small city, yet it's still viewed as a place of religious worship. This was still, of course, true of Mecca, but it was not something that would have been capable of exporting what is a fairly radical interpretation of Islam without money. Money. So I think in your counterfactual, where either there's no oil or oil doesn't matter or whatever, Mecca is still an important, maybe the most important religious site, but it's not going to be a site that's able to export a relatively radical view of Islam.
I will counter that with one point.
Yeah.
You know about the Padri Wars?
What about, yeah, what?
Padri Wars. So at the time that the Wahhabis took over Mecca, some Indonesian pilgrims went in like 1803. They go back to Indonesia and they launch a radical reform movement.
Yeah. I mean, so fair enough. I mean, you go far enough down the counterfactual chain. There are things that could happen. I'm not denying that this wouldn't have happened. I think it would have been highly unlikely for a Wahhabi form of Islam to spread the way it has in the last, especially in the 20th century, without petro-dollars. Because it's all yeah.
So when you look at the historical records, they don't. I mean, how do they talk about Mecca and Medina and their religion? Like, do they say that we should find out what they're doing? Like, so for example, there were so many Persian theologians. We mentioned Ghazali, but also Tusi, also Rumi, who then went to Konya or Divani, right? So were people ever saying, "Oh, what are they saying in Saudi? Should we have a listen?"
No, for the most part, there were different. This is kind of like what we talked about before. There were in different parts of the broader Islamic world. Again, going from the west coast of Africa all the way to Indonesia, local authorities mattered so much more than what was going on, and there wouldn't even really have been a capacity to know what was going on for just about anyone in say like Southeast Asia, or even frankly, even in Persia, this would have been something where local religious authorities would have been so much more powerful and influential.
Yes.
And part of this was also because we've talked about this, but it's not as if reinterpretation of new laws was really rapid after the 11th or 12th century. Again, I want to caveat the Get Ijtihad probably didn't formally close, but to some degree, the door was more closed than it had been before. So knowing what was going on in the Arabian Peninsula was just less important. And I frankly think it was less important really after the first few caliphs. I mean, once the Umayyad Empire moves up, they move up to Damascus. That's kind of the end of the to be clear, not the symbolic power. The symbolic power is still huge. I mean, taking the Hajj is one of the pillars of Islam. The counterfactual is not that Mecca would have completely lost its importance. But on the other hand, I think the counterfactual, where the spread of this particular brand of Islam spreads just because it's coming from the house that holds the keys to Mecca and Medina, I think it's highly unlikely.
Okay, let me ask one question and then another one. What I also understood that Mecca was you did need authority from Mecca to be a sultan. Like, for example, in Southeast Asia, where there was one female ruler and Mecca did not approve, and Mecca sent a telegram saying, "Get rid of her." So I don't know. One more thing. What about the authority of Al-Azhar? So that was founded in the 10th century. How much did people, when we were talking about lineage earlier and studying under the right people, so Al-Azhar did have authority, you think?
Yeah, I mean, it was part of that chain, and almost kind of a proper institutionalization of one chain of authority. And this is actually, it was part of the broader process that I was describing before, 9th, but particularly 10th centuries of institutionalization of authority. And the institutionalization of authority based on the way authority happens for Islamic religious scholars is through these chains of command, and who you learn from, who they learn from, etc. And I think that's what describes the power here.
Okay, so question: what would the Islamic world look like if Saudi Arabia did not have any oil wealth?
Great question.
Like, would we have seen an Islamic revival? Would we have seen this surge?
I mean, so one reason this counterfactual becomes very hard is, I think, European interest in the Middle East in the late 19th and especially early 20th centuries would have been less. and a lot of what the fallout from European interest in the Middle East in the early 20th century we're still dealing with today. I think it's very likely that the Middle East would be even kind of further behind economically than they were. There wasn't anything necessarily obviously dynamic in the economies, even the leading economies of what we'll broadly call the Middle East, North Africa here in, say, the 18th and 19th centuries. Even though I will say maybe a massive caveat here is I actually am working on a pretty big project with Timur Kuran at the moment, and what we're doing is looking. He's been he has this long-term project where he's been looking at Ottoman archives and looking at commercial transactions, and we are finding some evidence of dynamism in certain types of contracts where you're starting to see the birth of what we would call impersonal exchange, where you don't need to know who you're dealing with in order for it to happen. This is something that began 2 to 3 centuries prior in Europe, but it does yield this interesting counterfactual, which I think you're trying to get at here as well, is what would have happened in the Middle East had the colonial enterprise not come in, had the economies just been able to kind of move along at their own pace. I mean, what our data are suggesting is it's possible that something, a Middle Eastern version of a more kind of European style economy with more modern finance, even industry could have happened. It's a really hard question though, because once you remove one thing, once you start going to, essentially, I think you can always go one step in the counterfactual.
Right,
once you get to two steps, it becomes pretty hard to imagine that world.
Okay, awesome. Okay, now let's move into the 20th century more broadly.
Okay.
So here's my question. From Muhammad Ali and onto President Nasser and other Iranian and Bourguiba reformists, we see these Arab, Turkish, Persian reformists. Why do you think those liberalizing reforms were relatively short-lived?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, in many degrees, the great missed opportunity of the 20th century, for sure. And in all the places you talked about and more. I mean, I think it simply goes to the rise of autocracy in most of these states. This is now whether this is a remnant, and I think to some degree it is, of kind of the post-colonial regimes, where strongmen gain power in some places with the support of the religious establishment, in other places very much anti the religious establishment. I think that's it. I mean, I think that this type of kind of reform Islam that actually could be and probably would have been more associated with something like democratic governance, things that they were the type of reforms that a wannabe autocrat would not want in their state. I mean, yeah.
So you think that rulers slowed down the liberalizing, secularizing reforms because they encouraged democratization? So you think Sadat, for example, was increasing state-backed Islam for reasons of authoritarianism?
Yeah, to some degree. I mean, I certainly this idea.
Wasn't it a popular movement for piety rather than a top-down imposition?
Yeah, but those two things aren't necessarily, I think, contradictory. I mean, certainly most of these states had a more mainstream version of Islam that became state-backed. Now, whether that is a reflection of popular piety or popular piety followed is I mean, actually, I think it differs by state. But what that though kind of bringing this kind of more mainstream Islam into the state does is it does help squash again. And I should be clear here, because I think this is where your reaction was. I'm not saying that this was an explicit squashing of reform, like reform within Islam ideas. I think what it did, it had the effect of doing so.
Okay, I'll say one quibble, because I think that
Okay.
the liberalizing reforms were often autocratic top-down projects, right? So in Iran, the Pahlavis, they were imposing
for
secularism.
sure.
In Turkey, for example, there's this wonderful paper that I'll send you on Turkish censorship of cinema. In the 60s and 70s, they would not allow any contemporary portrayals of religion. They would allow films about religion back in the day with an imam or something.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting.
You couldn't have any display of people doing the namaz, praying, or doing Ramadan. And they were also very careful that the state authorities must always be shown in the most sort of upstanding light. And if ever even if there was a murder, and they would not let the killer go unpunished. And so they would not even let the murderer die before the police had asserted authority. So there was a very clear push with Turkish films to sort of show this secular authority and to show the state is very strong and capable. And that was, as I understand it, you're the scholar of the region, but in many of these regions, they saw the religious authorities as the threat to their own power, and they sought to quash and control it or bring it onto the state in order to buttress authoritarianism. So
Clearly,
I see some of that secularizing, liberalizing reforms as, one, to consolidate state authority, and two, as part of defensive modernization, that they think, we're behind, we need to catch up with the West. And how do we catch up with the West? Well, let's have some of these commercial reforms, for example. Let's have some of these liberalizing reforms. Let's be, in the Turkish, there were so many ideas. Let's be more like the West and, adopt certain.
But I think in this context, I mean, the Turkish context is clearly one, and I think the Iranian context would be another. I mean, this was done almost explicitly as almost it's an a-religious program. So that it's not as if the state in these cases was trying to bring in the religious establishment as part of the program. They were trying to quash the religious establishment for the most part. And so when we think about what that meant for even the types of reforms that could have been, complementary to what these fairly authoritarian rulers would have wanted, and again, a lot of them were somewhat Western looking, or at least, wanting to emulate some aspects. Any type of religious change that was, I think, almost dead on arrival in many of these states, at least in the mid 20th century, as the autocrats were trying to consolidate power. One thing that history, and this is something. So and also to be clear, this is something that I've read quite a bit about. I'm interested in, but most of my expertise is not really 20th century Middle Eastern politics, and most of this is just again based on my interest in what I read. But one thing that I'm on much firmer ground talking about, again, this would be both in the Middle Eastern but also Western Christian context, is that any type of religious change brings along with it a lot of uncertainty for what that means. The Reformation being the most obvious example, but this is also true of what Christians would have called heresies. You've mentioned Sufi movements. These things can yield sources of power also that are very different than previous sources of power. And any wannabe autocrat is going to be fearful of alternative sources of power emerging. And so, I mean, I think that that's something that needs to be kept in mind when thinking about what was going on in these 20th century states.
Yeah, the best example of that would be like the emergence of Arab nationalism or leftist movements in Turkey, Indonesia, and in Egypt, and whereby many rulers in Indonesia and in Turkey and in Egypt in the 1960s or 70s, they empowered the Islamists in order to squash the leftist movements, for example. So I think that's well evidenced. Okay, now I want to go back to Rubinese, to go back to the literature.
Okay.
Please do not joke when I talk about Rubinese.
I like it.
You should have due sincerity. Okay, let's just be serious. Okay, so let's just going back to my question: why were these liberalizing reforms so short-lived? Let us consider two perspectives, and I would like you to discuss them and vote on them. One is the economic frustrations that over the 1970s, upward mobility slowed, and you had all these people going to universities, and these disadvantaged young men, their dreams are thwarted, they're not getting what they wanted, and so that that frustration meant that there was setbacks, a loss of status. And then the Islamists say, you know, all this westernizing modernization has failed. The military defeat in Israel is God's punishment for following the West and neglecting Islam, and we need to go back to Islam. And that appeals in a context of economic stagnation. So one, there's that economic explanation. Then another explanation is the club goods idea, which you've written on so brilliantly, arguing that if you want to be a member of these religious clubs, then you signal piety in order to gain loyalty and those exclusive benefits. And that can drive sort of extremism because you want to signal that you're truly a member. How important do you weight those two explanations as a driver of the religious revival and textual literalism?
Well, so I don't think they're separate. I think they're actually one in the same. In that, you know, so there's a paper which I know you know of that I have with Jean-Paul Carvalho and Michael Sachs, where built a model that actually combines these two features. The idea being that, you know, as you described, you know, these kind of unfulfilled expectations emerge when you have, you know, society, you know, say like Egypt, there's massive reforms in the 1950s. To educate more of the population. The first generation does get government jobs, but then the next generation, you know, stuff like the oil shocks of the 70s cripple the economy. There's fewer jobs. So now you have this group of people that have unfulfilled expectations. Well, this then interacts with this very idea that actually we've been talking about here. You know, the state kind of brings in religion. It had moderated religion for actually several decades by that point. And what moderation of religion can do is it can open the door for more radical groups to come in and pick apart, you know, essentially pick off, you know, those who we might think were more prone, either whether they be underlying, they might have more religiosity, or as we noted here, they might have some type of unfulfilled expectations. And, you know, one thing that, you know, that becomes apparent, at least in the Egyptian case, things like the Muslim Brotherhood, is that these are mostly movements that are not run by the poor or uneducated. It's actually, they're much more highly educated on average, the biggest adherents. And that was something that I think is explained by this kind of combination of factors, that you have these people that are educated, they don't get the types of jobs they had been expecting. They have all these unfulfilled expectations. So what do? This again opens up the door for, you have both supply and demand now side explanations for why you have extremist groups emerging. You know, on the demand side, you have demand for something else, and it's not just, you know, whether it be kind of religious coping or, you know, how does one deal with unfulfilled expectations? Religion historically has been a mechanism through which we cope. And the state religion, being as moderate as it was not as attractive to a lot of the people that had these unfulfilled expectations as the Muslim Brotherhood or just more generally more radical groups. Because one thing that, you know, as you noted, that what the club model of religion tells us is that one way that especially more radical groups or more non-mainstream groups remain relevant is what they do is they impose costs on their members, secular costs, meaning, you know, joining a relatively radical group does reduce your, you know, your economic and maybe even social possibilities outside of the group. But what it does mean is that when you're in the group becomes, you know, has a lot of vitality. People are really engaged, and it becomes an alternative for people, especially people with unfulfilled expectations. So I think that, you know, going back to your set of questions, these are one and the same. That they both contributed in not just equal measure, but together in complementary ways towards the rise of really kind of what, you know, the rise of more radical groups in some parts of the world for sure, but also, you know, kind of, you might say like a post-Arab Spring, you know, there was knockout of dictators, but there was no democracy that followed as well. Yeah.
Okay, I want to say one thing that supports you and then 3 little questions.
All right.
So And I think one parallel, you may know Paula Rettel's work in Brazil, that she shows areas that were hit by oh, I must send you
No,
two
I
nice
don't.
papers.
Yeah.
Oh, I'll send it to you. Two nice papers where she shows areas in Brazil that were hit by trade shocks, but people had fairly weak social security. Those people were more likely to join evangelical groups and then express various support for evangelical leaders who then did much better. So I think there's some support for the idea that, club goods are useful and people derive support from membership.
Yeah, there's a few papers on actually I've seen on that. I don't know that specific paper, but there's a couple other papers on Pentecostalism in Brazil which show a very similar finding.
Awesome. Okay, so I'll send those in case you've missed them. Okay, but here are little questions. I was looking at our barometer data where people say whether they're a member of any kind of association, and I found curiously that it's only a minority of respondents who say they're members of religious associations. So it's 2% in Tunisia, 6% in Egypt, 17% in Iraq. The highest share is Algeria, 29%. So to me, that's pretty minor. Now, let me give you a little example. I was in Uzbekistan for a month and I stayed with one family in Tashkent. In the evening, the entire family was studying Arabic. It was genuinely very, very sweet. And they're all, they're Uzbeks, they're trying to read the Quran, and they're all doing, instead of watching the TV, instead of watching some crap on TV, they're all studying Arabic together. And, they're not a member of any, they're not doing it because they're a member of some club and they're getting benefits from learning Arabic. They genuinely want to understand Arabic. So, okay, then I also think another caveat is that in many, there's another paper I need to send you by Louisa Roberts, where she shows that across the Middle East and North Africa, there's been a rise in education, a rise in prosperity, but still you have this unexpected level of religiosity. And it's, in Kuwait is very, very wealthy, but people still support Sharia law. And you could say that's just because they've all been indoctrinated. But take places like Western Europe. So in Western Europe, where people are totally free, they're not oppressed, they're not forced to go under any religious education, they're not poor, they're not suffering. You've got, Muslims of all kinds of different wealth quartiles, and yet they're still extremely religious. So we've got surveys from all kinds of polling agencies that, talk about 40, very, very high support for gender segregation, very strong opposition to LGBT teaching in school. Even in Britain, one survey showed that 40% supported Sharia law in some parts of the UK. British Muslims are extremely religious. And similarly in Malaysia, I think it's now an upper middle income country, very high degrees of religiosity. Young people are voting for Islamist parties. I was there, a couple of months ago. So it's across the Muslim world. We see over time this rising demand for Sharia that doesn't seem strongly correlated with economic circumstances. Moreover, there are many poorer Buddhist or Christian countries that don't see that same revival. So even though it's totally true that in Egypt has economic stagnation and Egyptians have a terrible economy, if we look back more comparatively at a global perspective, though that the economic circumstances don't closely tie to the religiosity.
Yeah, so this is a broader phenomenon so I think the underlying thing you're getting at is what sociologists call the secularization hypothesis. I mean, this idea that as people become more educated, more wealthy, they're going to drop religion. In the 1990s and 2000s, there were a series of scholars that questioned this hypothesis, mainly because of the USA, not because of anything that was going on in the Muslim world, because the US remained fairly religious, even though it was obviously very wealthy. Now, something that's interesting about that is that's actually since been revised because the U.S. has become a bit less religious in the last few decades. So there was this idea, which I think might apply to the parts of the Muslim world, that essentially the U.S. was on a bit of a time lag based on historic circumstance. It was obviously founded as a place for religious dissidents. It's been very welcoming of different religious groups. I think there is a big distinction, though, between European Muslims and Muslims in the Muslim majority world. And I think, so obviously, there's the obvious distinction of just being in a minority setting where, community matters and things like that. But the other thing that I think actually might explain or partially explain both of the phenomena you're talking about here, and there's been some, I think, reasonably convincing work done on mostly looking cross country, and actually, frankly, though, in the quote unquote Christian world, that one of the big drivers of secularization is state support, is essentially, the rise of a welfare state. That's the bigger substitute for kind of strict religious belief, and that it's really when you see the rise of the welfare state that you start to see the declines, first in Europe, then eventually, and obviously the US, well, not obviously, but the US has a bit weaker welfare state. And to the degree to which, there's a much weaker welfare state in most of the countries you're describing, even though, a place like, I don't think it describes Kuwait. I don't think this describes, UAE, places like that, where, there are also small states that have a very, very peculiar recent history. But I think more broadly that's at least plays a role in it, in the persistence of religion despite higher education and despite increased income.
Jared, I disagree more strongly than anything you've said, because I don't think that tracks. I don't think that tracks the qualitative research about people's shifts. I totally buy. So there's a lot of research showing that when people get health shocks, they might become more religious. So Jeanette Benson has a nice paper showing that COVID led to more prayer. So I buy those little shocks. A nice little natural experiment from economists. But as a broader model of change, so if you look at Indonesia, for example, as soon as after the Reformasi, with the political liberalization, increased freedom, same in Uzbekistan, as soon as people get these increased freedoms, as soon as they've got the technology of communications on YouTube, and suddenly you get these religious preachers saying, you've got to be embracing the Quran, you've got to be having gender segregation, you've got to have modesty, you're going damn to hell unless you do all these things, you're either with us or against us, this Ramadan is very, very important as part of, being a proper Muslim. I don't think that necessarily everyone is this sort of agent thinking, I'm a bit insecure, I don't have good insurance, maybe I'll pray a bit more. I think I don't think that economist model captures the reality of what it's like to be a religious person who truly believes you're going to hell if you mix, or if you're causing fitna. Women's sense of responsibility for preventing fitna, for properly veiling themselves, they're not thinking, oh bugger, I don't have health insurance, I better veil.
I agree, and I agree with everything you said here. That said, I also think religion, any type of religion, is inherently a social phenomenon, and I think that when we want to look at why people's, whether they be adherence, religiosity, whatever you want to say, the first place we need to look is the social dimension. What are the people around them doing? What's their society doing? How is culture changing? How is ideology changing? And I don't think that's divorced from economic incentives. I certainly, economists do model these things this way, but I don't think that's the way we actually think about things, that people are like actually just calculating, I've got A, B, and C, and these are my incentives, and thus I am going to choose X. I think when we're talking about religious phenomena in particular, that we have to think about it much more from a social perspective. And for those reasons, that's how politics and laws and policies can play a role in shifting religious views, whether they be more pro-religious or more kind of apathetic to religion. So I don't think what you're talking about in places like Indonesia is incompatible with that view. And also to be clear, I mean, this is not to deny the idea that many people are just genuinely very pious. So, like the family you were staying with in Uzbekistan. I don't think that any one of our models or the way we think about things explains what a specific family does. We're trying to explain trends.
Of course. No, but I don't think that was an isolated anecdote. Like I'm saying, I meet so many people who are genuinely, that's just one example, and we shouldn't. And I'm not trying. But okay, let me give you another example, just to express my venom for the So, for example, British Muslims incredibly religious on every level. British Muslims are so religious, and let me give you, talking about statistics rather than anecdotes. For example, 74% of women in Britain work, but among Muslims, it's only 37%, right? And that's totally consistent with trends across the Muslim world, where female labour force participation is systematically lower than the global average. Now, in the UK, we have the National Health Insurance, whereby anyone who gets sick automatically gets treatment. So you've got benefits, you've got unemployment insurance. So we've got a wealth of social security benefits, but people are still opting for those. So that's what. So that just to push back again. Just
to be very clear, I think what's going on for Muslims in Europe is very different than in the Muslim majority world.
Okay.
I think that Muslims in Europe, it is more about community, and frankly, there's. We see this in the United States too, where I'm based. There's both historically and in the present, that the communities, especially migrants, and especially migrants that come poorer than society. Actually, even those that are top highly selected, so the even wealthier immigrants tend to social norms, and in this case religious norms, tend to strengthen among these communities because they're a way of keeping the community. And in fact, I mean, it's even similar to what I was just describing as the club model, in that there are certain aspects, there's certain beliefs clearly that Muslims have within, European Muslims have, that do limit outside economic opportunities. But again, what that does is it makes the community itself much more vital, or gives it more vitality. And I think that is a fundamental difference between what's going on in Europe versus in the Muslim majority world, where that mechanism just isn't at play, because you don't need that mechanism. You don't need essentially to ghettoize yourself as a group when everyone or most people are Muslim.
Yeah, the issue I have, and I think you're echoing the Alberto Bassin and Verdier paper here, the 2000 paper, right? The issue I have with that is it's so interesting to contrast different religious communities within Europe. So if you look at, for example, in India, female employment is very low. It's I think it's under 30%, whereas in the UK, over 64% of Hindu women work. So that's just a recap for listeners. The Alberto Bassin and Verdier idea is that when you're a religious minority, you're much more homogenous. You marry within your group. You practice. You preserve the practices in order to sort of keep the faith alive, keep the identity alive when there are so many threats around you. Whereas the Indian Hindu diaspora in the UK, for example, has assimilated far more, and similarly so in Spain. So there's a very different response of different religious minorities within Europe.
But I think there's a big difference between the South Asian minority, and this is true in the US too. Migrants coming from South Asia typically are much higher human capital than the average. Whereas many Muslims, that certainly in the U.S. and I believe in most European countries, that's not true of the Muslim population. It's much more widespread. And some are obviously refugees, but if anything, it's brain drain from South Asia that's happening, both to the U.S. and to the U.K. So that is a very different thing. I don't think that South Asian immigrants, definitely not refugees. South Asian immigrants are reflective of the broader South Asian population.
Sorry, I should clarify. So the US migrants, you're totally right, are different in that sort of 60% of Muslims in the US have higher education, right? So you're getting this very skill selective migration. That's it. In the UK and across Europe, the Pakistanis and Indians, Muslims from Indians are
Muslims,
Muslims from either Pakistan or India. There is no difference in the education levels of the migrants from India or Pakistan. The big not much difference, and it's even controlling for the level of education that Muslims are less likely to work. So the bulk of Muslims in the UK, for example, are from Pakistan. So to be clear, so it's very much a religious division. So whereas in France, for example, most of the Muslim population is from Morocco, for example. So it's because of colonial legacies in the Maghreb that we get slightly different, and also post
certainly also colonial legacies with of course, South Asian immigration.
Absolutely. So that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
That the practices, the differences between Hindus and Muslims in the UK isn't reducible to education, and that we didn't have a particular bias for higher educated Indians but less educated Pakistanis. But anyway.
So what's your favorite explanation for the lack of or the persistence of religion among Pakistani Muslims in the UK?
So I think that's really. So I think that people who believe in the Quran want to be religious, and given freedom, then they will be religious and set up religious institutions and madrasas and mosques and fund those and support those, and together create this religious environment, especially when you have large religious communities. Whereas I think what's so distinct about Hindus is that so much of the policing within India is among jatis. So, for example, to focus on gender, there is this idea of Sanskritization whereby jatis gain prestige through parda and seclusion of women. And so each jati will practice seclusion in order to gain status. So a chama, which is a low-ranking jati, will seclude their women in order to gain status. So as they get wealthier, they withdraw their women from the labor market.
I see.
But once Indians go overseas, then caste totally breaks down. So the Hindu diaspora, whether it's in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in the Caribbean, etc., or in the UK, caste breaks down. So a lot of that policing breaks down. So India has nothing, Hinduism has nothing inherent in its scripture and its ideology saying that they must have purdah. So once they're outside all those caste so I just think that there are slightly different mechanisms of social policing, whereas in Islam, the idea of gender segregation and modesty is so much more baked into the religion, like across all those.
I agree with that. Yeah.
So anyway, okay, I've got 2 more questions for you. 2 more questions, and we need to take a little bit of a world trip because I want to talk about the Protestant Reformation. Right. Okay. You say that printing was crucial for undermining Catholic authority in Europe. Now, today's information technology is so much more powerful, yet religious authority seems more resilient in many Muslim countries. Why hasn't digital technology had the same revolutionary effect as printing?
It's a great question. And I think that if you had asked somebody 40, 50 years ago, told them that there was going to be this massive change in digital technology, they might have expected there to be something akin to a Muslim Reformation. I think some of it goes back to some of the stuff we were talking about, namely, the types of states that emerged in the post-colonial world were very much, were certainly autocratic and suppressed, and really tried to make everything, bring religion into the state, and really tried to suppress anything outside of the mainstream. I think that clearly played a role. And to be clear, going back to the Reformation, this connection, I think a key aspect, it's not just printing equals Reformation. I think one key aspect is that there was a huge demand for reform of the church. And the reason, and this goes back several centuries, we know this because there were attempts at reform, they were just suppressed. So the question is whether is there a similar demand, an underlying demand? It would have to be a latent demand. It can't be something that would have been expressed before. Is there latent demand for the Reformation, for a reform of Islam? I mean, I think part of it goes back to what you're saying about the spread of Wahhabism, for instance. I mean, this is something that's very much state backed. That anything in the Saudi orbit that reeks of reform of Islam is going to be suppressed. And unlike prior to, say, the 19th century, the state now has the capacity to do this. In fact, what we've seen in other places, so like Iran would be a state where, so Iran is, I think, maybe the most interesting state of all, because it's a state that probably would have been the ripest for a reform. It's population broadly pretty Western looking for the most part, but it became a theocracy there, and that still exists today. I frankly think that something like a Reformation, we haven't seen it yet. I do think that doesn't mean we won't see it in our lifetimes. in at least in certain parts of the world. And if I had to take my bets, it would be Iran would be the most likely candidate. But that would also incur massive political change. I mean, that's part of the reason here too, is that any type of massive religious change like this is going to, even in states that aren't really reliant on religious authority, is going to have massive political implications.
Okay, I have another question for you. You have a great paper on Japan's Meiji Restoration, and you argue that after humiliating defeat, these southwestern daimyos adopted westernizing reforms and sought to learn from the West so they could overthrow the ineffective shogunate. And then once in power, they adopt more comprehensive westernization. What similarities and differences do you see with the Tanzimat reforms?
The Tanzimat is actually happening, not just it's actually kind of happening at the same time. Begins in 1839, but really kind of over the next several decades are put into place. They're end up largely being unsuccessful. That certainly doesn't arrest Ottoman decline. So one thing, this is the paper you're referencing is a paper with Devin Ma, a Chinese economic historian. And one thing that we are putting forth in this paper that I think I've always intuitively believed, but I never really thought through what it meant, what a model looked like, and what the appropriate historical points would be to make this point until talking with Devin, is that. So what Tanzimat tried to do, what Meiji tried to do, Meiji was successful, was to, at least on the surface, adopt what they viewed as the best forms from the West. So, whether that be industrial technology. Eventually, Tanzimat goes further. It's beginnings of some restraint on executive power.
Sorry, 2 seconds, Jared. My mother is calling. I'm at to have Isabel. I'm doing the podcast. I'm like a 15-year-old. She's knocking at the door. Izzy, 2 seconds. Please eat by yourself. She's calling me for dinner. Please eat by yourself, Izzy. Okay, sorry, Jared. Back to Tanzimat.
So one thing I think, so the big difference ends up being that, and this is what we're pushing at least, and I think that the more I've read about the Meiji Restoration, and actually particularly what we do in that paper is compared to China, there was at that time they had something similar called the self-strengthening movement, which the idea was, let's adopt all this Western technology, but underlying that kind of keep the kind of old kind of Confucian power, the old way of doing things on everything else. And what we noticed about, and what others have noticed about Meiji Restoration, is that there was a kind of a wholesale adoption of certain aspects of Western ideologies. They'd send their best students to Western universities. They'd bring back ideas, and it wasn't just the blanket adoption of things, whether those things be machines, capital, they be banks. It's a way of doing things. It's a way of viewing the world. And I think by the time you get to Tanzimat, we're also there had been actually 2 centuries in the Ottoman Empire of what were kind of known as this literature that was very backwards looking. That people understood that the Ottoman Empire was falling behind relative to the leading powers of Western Europe. They tried to justify this by not saying that there's something we need to emulate, say, in the West, but that we've fallen from where we were under the reign of Suleiman.
Yeah.
And this, I think that, and this is where my frankly, my thinking of the last 15 years has taken me. I think these kind of what you might even call ideological capital, I don't know if that's a good term, but that's the way I'm thinking about it. It has to be consistent with when you're adopting from a different society, whether that be, again, and to be clear, this is not just about adopting capital and the fruits of the Industrial Revolution. It's about, in many ways, when you're talking about moving into a fundamentally changing your economy, it's much more than just bringing in machines, bringing in factories, bringing in people that can run the factories. It's about, it ranges from, finance. It ranges from the way that governments interact with firms, which is a big one. all of this requires more than just adopting. It requires what we call, ideological adoption too,
Yeah.
at least on certain margins. And I think that that's where you see the difference. Back to your question, in Tanzimat, in the Meiji Restoration, is the Meiji Restoration was a wholesale adoption. When I present this, we even have this I think really telling painting of the treaty that ended the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895. You have the diplomats from Japan and China in the same room. The diplomats from China are in the traditional garb. The diplomats from Japan are in suits. And the idea we push here is that actually, obviously, what you wear doesn't matter. Like there are certain elements of ideological adoption that don't matter, but it was more of this is how we do things now. And I think that runs, again, from political institutions to economic institutions, like banks, and also laws too that help support finance, that help support industry. All of these things are part of one system, and I think that adopting parts of the system is really hard to do. And in fact, I don't think we really have almost any successful instances of this in history, of adopting part of the system and not adopting much more full-throated. I mean, we certainly have instances of that. The Meiji Restoration being really the first one that happens outside of the broader Western European orbit.
And let me add one thing that ties in nicely to your previous paper on secular stagnations, in that maybe because of Japan's economic success, that model gained more legitimacy.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So there's a self feedback loop. Okay, final question. Going back to your book, going back full circle, do you think religious authority is the primary constraint impeding the Middle East's growth today?
Today, I would say in part, but only because of the stuff we've talked about, namely the Saudi and more so Gulf state influence that now permeates much of this, at least Sunni Islamic world. I think if you want to take the most proximate causes, no, I think the most proximate causes are kind of both the actual confrontation, but also the proxy confrontations between the Saudis and the Iranians. I mean, I think that's going to be something that But
take Egypt's economy, like, for example, there's a nice paper by Herzog where he says, the big problem is you've got these privileged insiders who get like state land grants and state contracts, and you've got these marginalized outsiders, and Egyptian firms never grow. They stay small, they stay tiny, and no one's got any incentive for meritocratic hiring because whether you're getting the government contract or not, and no one's got any incentive for technological adoption. So they say, it's all sort of cronyism. How much would you weight that versus everyone
in Egypt? In Egypt, it's huge. In Egypt, this is going to be something where I would say there's not a one size fits all across the Muslim world. In Egypt, and actually in several of North African states, and actually a couple in Middle Eastern states as well, the ones that really have had the post-colonial experience of the autocrat, that continues to be an issue. That is, I would say, religion is at best a secondary importance in kind of the potential for persistent stagnation. Egypt's no longer it's a middle income country now, but in terms of ever coming remotely close to, say, joining OECD, something like that, I think what you've described is much more important than religion in the 21st century. Okay. On the other hand, when you're talking about Saudis, Iranians, who are really kind of the dominant powers now in the region, I guess, along with Turkey, religion plays a bigger role, I think, but it's more so in terms of geopolitics, which is obviously consistent with the way I've been thinking about things. It's really religion, not so much for religion's sake, but the way it plays in geopolitics and political economy than anything else. So I think again, not a one size fits all by any means.
Okay, Jared, having schooled us for 2 hours in Rubinese,
wow!
I thank you very, very much for your time. This has been wonderful, superb, and a real pleasure to meet you and interact with you.
Yes, very much the same.
I have greatly enjoyed it. Okay, so to all my listeners, what can you tell them? What should they be looking out for coming forward from Rubinese? Give them a taster, give them some excitement, give them some juice.
All right. So I've been working on a book for actually the better part of 10 to 15 years with my advisor, Avner Greif, and we're trying to reconceptualize something that I've been working on for a very long time, and he as well. How political legitimacy evolves over time and space, and what we're doing is we have several chapters that it's not a retelling of English and Chinese political history, but it's I think a reconceptualization of how important political legitimacy was into the transitions under the Tudors and Stuarts, as well as thinking about how we can conceptualize different imperial dynasties throughout the entirety of imperial China. So that's a book we've been working on for a while, and hopefully it'll be coming out pretty soon. I've been saying that for a few years though now. So, but that's probably the next big project in terms of book length project.
Okay, I am very excited. I will read it. I will study it. So that I'm fully up to date in Rubinese. Honestly, It's been a total pleasure, and I wish you have a lovely, lovely day in California.
Yeah, same to you.
Thank you. Okay,
Thank you.
Now, Jared, I'll stop it there. All we need to do is just make sure that your thing is 100% uploaded. So I'll stop the recording,